continue in a sermon series where we've been looking at the first chapter of John's Gospel. For those of you who don't know, John is one of the four Gospel writers, and he is the one that is least likely to show up on a Who Wrote This Christmas Story survey, because John doesn't have the shepherds, and he doesn't have the angels, he doesn't have the Mary and the Joseph manger scene. John leaves out all the stuff that we normally think of when we think of Christmas. But what John does have in his Christmas story is the eternal perspective of God. That in the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. And we see that how eternally important that Jesus Christ really is. That his coming into the world is the apex and the highlight of all human history. And we saw that 2 weeks ago, that's the very foundation of creation. But we saw last week that there's even more to it than that. That it's the foundation of our life. That Christ is our light and our life and our guide. And this week it becomes even more relevant. It's even closer to home if that's possible. Because today we begin to see the way God desires for us to relate not just to Him, but He lays down the example for us to relate to one another as well. We read today from John's Gospel. We begin at John chapter 1, verse 6. Let us listen for God's word. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh, and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me. From his fullness we have received grace upon grace." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Relationships are such an important part of our life. And another reality of our relationships is that every one of them is broken. Now that may sound harsh, but you know that it's true inherently, unless you would claim that you have a perfect relationship somewhere. None of us do. There's brokenness that enters in every one of our relationships. Now some are admittedly more broken than others, but every one of us realizes that there's brokenness in our relationships, and some of that has to do with the brokenness that's within us, and some of it has to do with the brokenness that's in the other person, but they add up to a relationship that doesn't work exactly like God would hope that it worked. And that wouldn't be a big deal if relationships weren't so very important and critical to who we are, but they are. Relationships are so very built into us that we cannot avoid them. If you've ever taken a Myers-Briggs personality test, some of you may have, and some of you may not know what I'm talking about at all. But if you've taken a Myers-Briggs personality test, then you'll know that test categorizes people. And one of the categories that it categorizes them as is introvert, extrovert. And in order to figure out if you fit into one of those categories or the other, they'll ask you questions like this. Are you the kind of person who never meets a stranger? Do you have lots and lots of friends? And some of you have got that personality. That's just the way you are. And if I had to ask, you'd raise your hands and say, yep, that's me. But there are others of you who would say, well, I'm not that outgoing. I don't have lots and lots of friends. But the 2 or 3 friends that I do have that are near me are very close friends. So some of you tend to develop your relationships this way. You keep a very few friends very close. But either way, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, it's interesting to look at the way we relate to each other. You'll notice if you ever take one of those tests, the option that's not on there. There's not an option for I have no friends at all. And that's not an option because there's no such person that really exists that way. We all have a craving and a desire to be in relationship. We all relate differently, but we all relate. Relationships are built into who we are. They're part of our God-given makeup, and they have to be a part of our full life in order for us to be fully in relationship with God. We need to be fully in relationship with each other as well. Speaking of the brokenness in our relationship, I know there are some people who would say, my relationships are fairly good. Yes, there's some brokenness in it. But there are other people who would say that there's a very deep and painful brokenness in some of their relationships. There was a woman who opened up her heart to me when I was serving as a hospital chaplain in seminary. I won't go into details about the person or the nature, but she opened up her heart to tell me about the brokenness in her mother-daughter relationship. That her mother had done things to her that were physically and mentally terrible. I won't go into the details like I said, but you can imagine how terrible human beings can sometimes be one to another. It led to a very broken and strained relationship. But she found out later that it didn't begin there. It actually began even further back than that. Her grandmother had treated her mother that same way. There was a brokenness that was generational. And it happens often this way. When our relationships are broken, we pass that on, unfortunately. And I believe that this has probably struck a chord with you. If not directly, you know someone that's near your heart that's faced a kind of situation like this. One where you just go, why? Maybe you've never asked this question. Maybe you've never dared to ask it. Or maybe you've asked it again and again. You say, what does God have to do with that relationship? Why, God? And it's an important question for us to begin to ask. If we believe that relationships are important, then we must ask our God to have an answer for this. To say, what do you want, God, from the brokenness in our relationships? What do you want from this? And I encourage you to begin to bring in your relationships as we start to think about this question. Maybe some of you have very broken relationships like the one I described, or maybe they're fine, but they just need some adjusting. Either way, bring those relationships into this conversation as we ask and we say, God, what do you have to do? Well, what do you want from the brokenness in these relationships? And maybe the best place to start is by talking about what God doesn't want from our relationships, what he doesn't desire as we relate to one another. And one of the things God does not desire is deception. God asks us not to be deceptive in our relationships with each other, but this isn't always easy. In the age of cell phones here, I will tell a story by way of confession, although I imagine many of you probably understand this as well. Sometimes I will get a phone call from someone and I will check my cell phone. Look at the number that's calling. Sometimes it's a family member. And I'll say to myself, I know what they want to talk about. Or I'll say, I know this person is going to talk forever. And so what do? I will hit the ignore button or let it go to voicemail until I can get to it later. But then sometimes you'll bump into that person before you get back to them and they'll say, hey, did you see my call? Or did you get my voicemail? And what do you say? Oh, no, I couldn't get to my phone at that point in time. I was a little too busy to pick it up. So by way of confession, I'm saying here that sometimes I can, and I think sometimes we do, let those deceptive elements slip into our relationships with each other. But God calls us to be honest and authentic in our relationships. In John chapter 1, verse 14, the second part of that verse says that we have seen the glory of God. Just want to stop for a second and say that this is important for the Old Testament listeners. When the people would see the glory of God, there was this legend and this legacy around the glory of God. If you were to look at the glory of God, it would be too much to bear. You couldn't do it. You couldn't look directly into the face of God. You couldn't look at his glory. But what we see here is John bringing that to bear. We have seen the glory of God in the one and only Son, Jesus Christ. And what does it say then? That he is full of grace and truth. Grace and truth. And we see that in the scriptures. When Jesus relates to people, he relates to them in this amazing way that we all strive toward, to treat people with both grace and with truth. There's a story where a woman who is caught in sexual sin is brought to Jesus, and he exemplifies grace and truth. The people who bring this woman forward and are accusing her, they say, Jesus, what do you want us to do? The law says we should stone her. That's the truth, Jesus. And he says, okay, then you without sin cast that first stone. That's the grace element, because no one was without sin. No one could cast that first stone. They all walked off. The only one without sin that was left standing is Jesus. And he also treated her with truth. He didn't deny the reality of the relationship between them and the relationship she had with others. And he said, go and sin no more. We see him treat people with such grace and truth. Sometimes deception is so easy for us to use. There's a commercial I think many of you have probably seen if you watch TV. If you don't, you'll just have to nod your head along the way here. But there's a commercial on TV, a very prevalent Subway commercial. It's an office setting, and there's a kind of a nerdy looking guy that's eating a Subway sandwich. And a beautiful young girl comes up to him, and she wants his Subway sandwich. And in one way or another, she convinces him that she will go out with him if he will give her the sandwich. And she leads him on, right? So she's leading him on to believe that there might be something on down the road if I can just get that Subway sandwich from you. And in the commercial, it's hyperbole, but in our life, it's reality. That we choose to manipulate people. We choose to use the truth in order to get what we want. And we realize that, and we know that we shouldn't do that Christ is grace and truth, and we strive not to do that. And it's easy sometimes for us to say, yes, we need to do better, when it has to do with answering the cell phone instead of ignoring it, or it has to do with saying, I'm not going to manipulate people now. I know I need to not try to get that Subway sandwich by lying or misleading to people. But it becomes really difficult when we use deception as a defense mechanism. When there's someone who's hurt us deeply in life, and rather than deal with that, we keep them at arm's length, using lies or altering the truth or manipulating reality. Rather than deal with them, we say, I'm too busy. Or we say, I can't today. And what that really means is it's too painful. But it's a way of manipulating them even still. And Christ calls us to follow his example, full of grace and truth. Not always easy. Not always easy to do. One of the things God does not want from our relationships is deception. But another thing, and perhaps even more importantly, God does not desire for us to be apathetic toward one another. For those of you who may have not heard that word before, apathetic means you just don't care. It's not that they're your enemy. You're just not real passionate about them either. It's not one way or another. You're just apathetic towards someone. But this is so very dangerous. And Christ calls us away from apathy in our lives. For those of you who have ever served as teachers in schools, then you know that there can be students who are apathetic. There were two students who were sitting in their middle school convocation. The principal was giving a long and boring speech. The guys were getting so frustrated that they had to be there in that convocation listening to this principal who was not interesting at all. And at one point in the middle of the speech, the principal says, the greatest trouble that faces our young people is ignorance and apathy. And one boy turns to the other and he says, what in the world is ignorance and apathy? And the other boy says, I don't know and I don't care. But you don't have to be a student, and you don't have to be a teacher to understand that apathy is a dangerous part